never met Johnny before, and I didn't think sadly that I would be seeing him so soon afterwards at the Shir house of Bernard. And just to say, Bernard was a faithful attender at our meetings. It wasn't always easy for him. He had needed a bit of help with his walking. And the last meeting that he attended, Johnny's meeting, it was clearly a struggle for him, but he was determined to come. And it was really our pleasure that he did. And so he spoke about the Jews of Tredegar not so long ago, and we will remember him with great affection. Tonight, Stefan has talked before about various aspects of long-standing Jewish history, the Cairo Geniza, for which his name will always be associated. But when I spoke to him about a talk tonight, he had something very different in mind, and he will explain this to you. I don't think I really need to say more than that, and we will hear about this Jewish, Galician, Polish archive. Stefan.
Thank you very much, Ken. You hear me? That's is that okay? Can you hear me?
I think you give me a hand just lifting this up. Because I can try and pop this up a bit.
That's too much. That was, by the way, an ideal introduction. There was once a rabbi, I will not mention his name, in northwest London, who I went to give a lecture in his community, and about the Cairo Geniza. And he said, Professor Reif is here and he's going to talk about the Cairo Geniza. Let me tell you something about the Cairo Geniza, he said, and went on for about 15 minutes. You know, had it happened to me later in life, is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
I think I would have said, well, your rabbi has told you everything, I'm going home. Wasn't brave enough to do it at that time. What I want to share with you this evening is some remarkable discoveries which we have. And by the way, I've got now 1, 2, 3, 4 members of my family here who are, of course, from the same Reif family. And I just want you to know that if any of you start booing, they will deal with you.
After. On the way out.
Good. So, my father was born in Galicia in 1911, and the remarkable thing was that he really told us almost nothing about his family. And so we have very little information about him. Pinchas was his name, and here he is in the Polish army during the Second World War. He was a Polish sailor, merchant seaman, and also a Polish soldier, and a non-commissioned officer, whose recruit said to my mother, "You're getting married?" And my mother said, "Yes." To whom? Pinchas Reif. "That little bastard," they said. So he was quite a character, put it that way. And but he had very either selective memory, or he didn't really notice what was going on, and I'll try and explain that as we go through. When I was in the Baltimore area lecturing in near Bethesda, it turns out that one of the people there, working at the National Heart and Lung Institute, said to me, he's got a colleague whose wife is a Reif family. And so it turns out that Harriet Greenwald and I shared 2 great-grandparents. And even more exciting was, this is only 20 years ago, that they had kept the Yiddish letters that her grandfather, Avram Yitzhak, known in America as Yaakov, had received in New York from his father in Galicia, all the letters. So that wasn't the end of the story, because Adolf's sister, Rose, in New York had also kept the letters, and her grandson, Jeff Brown, had inherited these. And he and Laura, that is the daughter of Harriet Greenwald in Washington, and other members of the family, including myself, arranged translations from the German and the Yiddish of the originals. And we were therefore able to reconstruct the family's early history. My wife is almost native German speaker. She was born and brought up in Czechoslovakia, and the part of Czechoslovakia was also German speaking, so she knew Czech and German. And with my knowledge of Yiddish and her knowledge of German, we were often able to put right the translations, because translations, if you know German, you know classical German, Mittelhochdeutsch, you're not necessarily going to do a very good job with Yiddish. It varies enormously. So that's a bit of the background to what happened and how we have this out. There are about maybe 100 letters in Yiddish and in German, postcards, letters, and then documents and photographs and so on. So most of what I'm reconstructing for you here this evening is only a little, al kapota mazleg, as they say in Hebrew, just on the edge of the fork, a little aspect of it, because when I was sitting down to prepare the lecture, I realized that I could easily go on for 3 or 4 hours, but I don't think Kenneth would be very impressed if I did that. So I tried to reduce it to at least the essential elements. And in due course, of course, and the funny thing is, it's paradoxical, for 40 odd years I spent looking at archives, the archive from the Cairo Geniza, and now we have a family Geniza, a family archive. So I thought I was out of archives, but now I'm back in the thick of an archive. What are the principles involved if looking at an archive like this? Looked at from the point of view of a historian, what's the issues? Well, the issue is ordinary people have one version of what goes on, and establishments have another. So any of you who've ever known the story of a city, a shtetl, a community, and you read something written by what we call in Yiddish, the big shots, right? The leaders, the establishment, and you think that's not what my Zayda said, that's not what my grandfather said. It's exactly right. So you have the ordinary people's version and the establishment's version. And then you have oral records. Again, the last, 40, 50 years, records have been terribly important. We want to hear what people say. Because again, literary studies, you have a study of the Jews of Galicia, Poland, whatever, it's a literary study. It may have a better analysis in many respects than the ordinary people telling you his or her story, but on the other hand, the ordinary person's story sometimes reveals what didn't go on. I know that from Edinburgh. I know the stories told by the Edinburgh community, and Kenneth interviewed my late uncle over it. The stories of what went on among the community in various communities, little Hasidic communities in Edinburgh in the 1920s was suppressed. Suppressed by what my grandfather, my Zayde, called the English Chevre, or the English Chayas. The English, the people who did English in the shul and the top hats and all that kind of thing, not real Yidden as far as he was concerned. When I used to come home from shul when he was already unwell, I couldn't come, he would say, who said the he who today? You know the he who is? He who giveth salvation unto kings and dominion unto princes. The he who. Because that was all they knew, they didn't know much English. So that's important. Impressions versus footnoted accounts. You can write, when I was about to write autobiography, some people here have got it and have read it. If you haven't read it, you ought to read it. Go away and find it, and it doesn't cost very much money. It has, yes, it has. Kenneth, there you are. What more advanced comment do you want than Kenneth supported the publication of it. So when I was about to write this, I spoke to a professor of history and I said, all my life, since my 20s, I've been writing comments, analysis, footnotes. How do I approach my own history? And he said, no. That's impressionistic. Forget the footnotes, forget the backup, forget the bibliography. You are giving your impressions. When somebody writes about your life in 50 years' time, they will say, Reif claims in his autobiography that he was wrong, he had the wrong impression, here's the truth, and so on. So it's a different analysis, a different way of looking at things. And here, with this new record, we have a completely different source. And then you have self-definitions. What did my father, my grandfather in Galicia, how did they see themselves as distinct from looking at the broader source materials? You look at books of the Jews of Galicia, it won't match, or in some respects it might, but in many ways it won't match what we've discovered. So what are the problems? Well, the problems are very similar to what we came across when we were looking at the Cairo Geniza. The first problem is calligraphy. You have Yiddish, and unless you know Yiddish, very difficult to read it, right? So here you have a typical example. He's writing from Stanislaw, he does the German. Stanislaw is Stanislavov, it is now Ivano-Frankivsk, and it's part of West Ukraine, it was East Galicia. East Galicia, where my family came from, the capital is Lemberg, Lvov, as my father called it, and Lemberg, as the German speakers called it, and today it's Lviv, according to Ukrainians. Interestingly, my father used to say, and it's really, in some respects, been proved to be true, he said in Poland, the Poles were the gentry, the Poles were the professionals, the Poles were the professors, the Jews ran all the businesses, the Jews ran the economy, and the Ukrainians were peasants. And I say that to Ukrainians, they don't get very pleased with it, but there's a certain truth in that. And that's how society worked at that time. So here you have Yiddish, that's what you've got to work it out from what you see, and starting to read it is very difficult. Once you get into it, it becomes more easy. You have the German, the old Courant style of German writing, some of you may know it, very difficult in itself. It's again a different kind of style of German, and then you have in the later, more modern German, which is more easy to read, and which my wife Natan can read fairly easily. So we struggle over the first two types, very, very big struggles, and the third one is much easier. But again, you need contexts. I really need to say something before we look at some examples. I need to say something about what is Galicia? What is this time up already? Galicia is known in Yiddish circles as an area where millions of Jews live, very impoverished Jews. But you have to understand there was a background to why is it called Galicia? Galicia is based on the name of a city called Hadash, a historic city on the Dniester River, now western Ukraine, 50 kilometers northeast of my father's birthplace, the family's birthplace, Kalisz. The city gave its name to the historic province of Galicia, to the Principality of Hadash, Galicia, and to the Kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, of which it was the capital until the 14th century, when the seat of local rulers moved to Lvov. So that's the origin, and if you look at some maps of the time, here is Hadash. Actually, Hadash is there this is Hadash itself, on the Dniester River. It was actually a Karaite center. And Jews who believed not in the Talmud, not in rabbinic literature, but only in the Bible, Kara, Mikra. So that's as it were, the capital of those days. And the river Dniester ran from the Carpathians. Kalisz is on the foothills of the Carpathians. Carpathians is a continuation of the Alps, but much gentler, much less high. And that river goes all the way to the Black Sea. Galicia in the 14th century. Here you have the kingdom of Rutynia and Galicia. Rutynia, 13th century to 14th century, a little bit larger. And here I can point out that actually, here's Lviv, and here was Kalush, but Kalush was on the edge of the great Kingdom of Hungary. I was in Budapest at a conference, and I was talking to one of the people there, a Hungarian scholar, and I said, well, my father was from Kalush. Where is that? Near? Oh, that was Hungary. And they claimed it as Hungarian because it was at that time on the border. And my father's Kalush was on the Carpathians. On the other side of the Carpathians was Hungary. Now I think Romania and Transylvania, and very Hasidic strength, strong Hasidic communities. Then in the 16th century, why are there so many Jews there? Well, in the 16th century, Poland, the kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, look at it, it's huge. Goes right from what we call Germany today through, and this is Polish, Królestwo Czeski, which means kingdom of Czech kingdom, all the way through past Hungary, into areas that today Mr. Putin would certainly claim as Russia, and this is all part of the kingdom of Poland and Lithuania. Very affluent kingdom, and they needed people to bring in people, influx of lots of minority groups as the kingdom expanded, and one of lots of minority groups that he brought in, the kings of Stefan Reif, and there were various kings of that time, famous kings. Only half of the population of 8 million were Poles. The others were Russians, Ukrainians, Germans, Czechs, Armenians, and Tartars, which there remained quite a lot until the Russians cleaned out everybody in 1945, got rid of everybody else and brought in only Russians. Ukrainians were there already, they were left. And from 1532, the Jews, remember, had been expelled from England in the 13th century, from France in the 14th century, from Spain in the 15th century, and the Jews came into Poland at that time, in the 16th century, and they were engaged in many, many business activities, so that the number grew from 30,000 to 150,000. That's a lot of people in the Polish-Lithuanian state. The problem was that the Polish nobility, they elected their kings, and they could never agree about elections. So it was difficult, and therefore gradually the whole thing became corrupt because of lack of agreement, and they were gradually swallowed up by others. And the others who swallowed them up, and today there is, if you talk to Poles, there's still a great deal of resentment of Poles, of Germany and of Russia, less of Austria now, because Austria is a tiny little rump of a country. If you go back to my father's time, when my father was born, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Huge empire, hundreds of millions of people, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, parts of Germany, Poland, Italy. It was all part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So in 1772 and 1795, the three partitions of Poland made these three great countries, helped themselves to what had been Poland, and divided it up. And the part that was annexed to Austria was the province of Galicia. Most of the area stretching from the southwest of Krakow, Krakow itself was included later, to the territory around Tarnopol, as they called it in Yiddish and in Polish, but Ternopol in Ukrainian, about 120 kilometers east of Lemberg, and south even for 200 kilometers. So a very large area, and suddenly, all these Jews here, this is, by the way, the Russians inherited a million Jews or whatever it was, they also had problems with Pale of Settlement, trying to force them to live in particular areas. But all these three countries suddenly were faced with large Jewish populations, and Galicia, the Austrians were faced with this large population. And the Austrians recreated the medieval area, territory, kingdom if you like, on the king eventually later. This is all, by the way, Maria Theresa and her Joseph II and their families, eventually Kaiser Franz Joseph. Kaiser Franz Joseph was the Kaiser, was the king, was the ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Reich through most of the 19th century. And so here you have the recreation of Galicia here as part of the Austrian Empire. What about the Jews in Austrian Galicia? Well, interestingly, 200,000 Jews extra for the population of Austria, and that had expanded to 500,000 by the middle of the 19th century, 10% of the population. In places like Kalisz, the Jews were 50% of the population. 50% of the population. And so it's major Jewish center. And what's interesting is the Austrians started by Joseph II, end of the 19th century, started by getting the Jews to take surnames. The story is, you know, if you had to be interviewed by an Austrian bureaucrat, if you gave him 10 gulden, he called you Goldberg. If you gave him 5 gulden, he called you Silberberg. If you gave him 2 gulden, he called you Copperman. And so on, so it goes on. And if you didn't give him any money, he called you Katzenellenbogen. Cat's elbows, right? So the Jews were introduced into this culture, which was a Germanic culture. They insisted that Jews go to school. There are lots of interesting stories about young Jewish women who were suddenly interested in learning, in studying. And at home, of course, they were not encouraged to do that, but they saw lots of young women who spoke Polish and German and knew how to read novels, and some of them actually went to convents and asked the nuns, could the nuns educate them, train them, teach them, which the nuns did, but at a cost. The cost, of course, was conversion, and many of them converted. Some came back to their families, some didn't. But it's an interesting story because it's obviously this was happening. I say this because how can it be that my great-grandmother is writing a letter? How is she so literate? My other great-grandmother, my grandmother from the Russian side couldn't read and write. Highly intelligent woman who never was taught to read and write. Women reading, writing. Why should a woman want to read and write? Right? So in Galicia it wasn't so, and it's interesting that we've got some evidence of that. There were many shtetl in which the Jews amounted to half the population, but they had large communities in Krakow, Lwów, Zolkier, Przemysl, Brody, and lots of names of lots of shtetl that you can't pronounce unless, like me, you were taught by your father how to pronounce RZ, CZ, SZ, DZ, and I had to go through them as a child. And so on, because that's a Slavonic language, and the Slavonic languages are all with J and J. Here is, just about the time we're talking about, the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. Here is Kalisz, here, right up there. And Krotzin is nearby. Novi Kalisz means the new area of Kalisz, and other areas around about. So it was, by the way, you see the railway going through. The railway ending up in Vienna, of course, and that was a main railway, I think all the way to, if I'm not mistaken, from Lwów, Lemberg to Vienna. The Jews in 1914, the women ran off to, this was the battleground of the First World War between the Russians and the Austrians. The women ran away to Vienna, the men were not allowed to go away, they had to stay. So that's also part of the background. Kalisz itself is in the very picturesque foothills. It's a lovely, beautiful little city, fertile area on the Lomnica River, which runs into the larger Dniester River that I told you about. Population in 1900, back when these letters were all written, half of them were Jews, 4,000 Jews, and they ran all the small businesses. Here is the Lomnica River. My father used to tell the stories of what he didn't go to school. He always said there was no school during the First World War, when my sister Sharon and my wife and I went to Galicia, we went to the school where my father was supposed to go. And we said it was a pity that if school was not open during the First World War. The teacher said, the person in charge said, it was open the whole time, we never closed it for a single day. So my father simply didn't go to school. And he was on his own, his grandfather had been killed, his father had been killed, he was left with his mother, his aunt, his grandmother and his sister. So you can imagine what kind of child he was. What he used to do is, he and two friends, one Jewish, one Catholic. Catholic one was Stefan. Why I'm Stefan? Because Stefan, his Catholic friend, was killed in the Second World War, and his family tried to save my grandmother but failed. So this is where they used to go. They used to steal some bikes, cycle out a few kilometers to the Lomnica, and how did you learn to swim, Dad? How did you learn to swim? A big guy, two big guys, threw me in the river and taught me to swim. That's how you did. No wonder I was terrified to swim. So that was his story of the time, the Lomnica River. And here is Kalisz. This is Kalisz on the hill, on the Carpathians, just from a few kilometers away, all the way across the top is Kalisz, as it is today. The Jews at the time, under the Habsburg Empire of Franz Joseph, whom they greatly admired, they always told wonderful stories about Franz Joseph. Well, there was no question that they did not regard it as bad as the Jews in Russia. The Jews in Russia under the Tsar were all the time having pogroms where, although there was anti-Semitism in Galicia, there was a semblance of order, of law and order, so that it was more difficult to do pogroms, and the pogroms that did happen happened when the Russians came in. So he was very popular. Franz Joseph lived a long time and really made 2 or 3 mistakes. One of the mistakes was going into the First World War, and he also made a mistake of declaring war on Prussia, which was much stronger than him, Bismarck's Prussia, and that weakened Austria considerably. There were attempts to improve the status of the Jews, but on the other hand, there were occasionally attacks, and the attacks were often inspired by the Ukrainian church. Particularly, the Russian priests and the Ukrainian priests were particularly anti-Semitic. The Catholics also, but perhaps on the whole, maybe less stridently so. But of course, there's anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as late Jonathan Sachs told us, is just a virus that keeps mutating, and it finds all sorts of forms. So the culture against which all these letters are written is a Germanic culture. And the Jews became interested not only in German, but in Polish, because the gentlemen, the nobility, the professionals whom they saw were Poles, and to speak to them in Polish. And although there was a lot of poverty, many Jews succeeded professionally, academically, and their famous 19th century Jewish personalities originated in Galicia. The story of, again, here it's a question of establishments. The Lithuanian, Litvak establishment, the Russian Jewish establishment, the Yekkish German Jewish establishment, and the Austrian Jewish establishment looked their noses down at Galicia, Galician Jews, Galicia. So they regarded it. In fact, just finished reading a book in Hebrew about the amazing intellectuals of the middle of the 19th century in Galicia. And there were quite a number. And they were very productive and very brilliant. And they led a Haskalah movement. People, as we were together in, my sister Sharon and I, in Lemberg, in Lvov, and looking at that. You can see how Habsburgian, all the little villages in Galicia to this day have elements of the Habsburg Empire. And that's one of my father's uncles writing to another, and he's writing in German. He's writing in German. So they knew German, they also could write Polish, but when they went to America, of course, many of them went to America and they stopped using these other languages. So here you have all the places among which the Jews thrived. All of these places, Drohobych, Przemysl, Lesko, Stry, Kalush, as you see, Stanislavov, Chortkov, Buchach. You know who was born in Buchach?
Yeah.
Agnon. Shmuel Yosef Agnon was
He
born.
went to
He's
Cheder
another.
with my grandfather.
Sorry?
He went to Cheder with my grandfather.
Oh, wonderful. There you are. You went to Cheder in Buchach. Again, you have to know how to pronounce Polish. Otherwise, Buchach gives you big problems. Buchach. So there were all these places which were famous for their Jewish communities. Novi Sad, near on the other side of this is Eastern Galicia is Lvov, Lemberg. Western Galicia is Krakow. Capital is Krakow. And here you have Kalush. So that's 1914, and that then became the center of the war between the Russians and the Austrians. So it was actually a battleground. So you can imagine how difficult it was for people living there, how difficult life was. Pictures, as we took them, of this is the Rynek. Rynek in Polish means market. The Rynek in Kalush, that was how it looked in 1900. So that would be what the family was familiar with, the marketplace full of Jewish traders, 2 days a week, I think. And that's where they all made their business. And this is the remains of that's the square today, with some old buildings still remnants of what you see up there. That's here. And they've kept it very nicely, actually, the town square today. This is the station, the railway station. I mentioned the railway station because here you have, in the middle of that picture, is an Austrian policeman. And one of my father's cousins or uncles, he never knew, but it's in the book about Galicia, about Kalush. There's a book about the Jews of Kalush called, it was a policeman who was called Malakondra. I have no idea what I'm trying to find the word. I don't know if anybody here has got any ideas. I'd be grateful. But this policeman was called Malakondra. It was full of his own importance as a policeman until 1914. It was 1918, 1919, the whole thing broke up and he lost his status. So quite what he was, an uncle of my father or a cousin of my father, we don't know. We only know that he was called Reif Malakondra. Mala is probably bad. What Kondra is, I have no idea. But we'll find out in due course. So that was the railway station. And then you have a famous artist at the time doing a picture of Kalush, the poorer areas of Karl Heinrich Vogler, 1872 to 1942. And that's also there. Again, Habsburg, very Habsburgian. Again, same thing, again. And it gives you an idea. So now we come to the actual family. My great-grandparents in 1911, here they are. This is, again, photographs sent to the family in New York. This is Chaya Sprinze. Chaya Schechter, married at the age of 16, of course with a sheitel. And my father remembers that without the sheitel she was shaved, completely shaved head. So he remembered that. She told him he would either be a big success or a criminal. You can imagine he was neither in the end, but she tried to instill some discipline in him and completely failed. So Chaya Schechter, 1854 to 1930, she was married in 1870 at the age of 16 to my great-grandfather, whose name was Avner Yehuda, always called Leib, maybe because Yehuda Leib, but Avner Yehuda Leib. Everybody called him Leib. I don't know whether the clothes indicate to anybody who's an expert in the way that Jews dressed, whether that tells us about whether it was a Hasidic background or a non-Hasidic. You see his payot, of course, but that wouldn't be unusual. Big beard also wouldn't be unusual. And here he is with the kind of capelage, as they call it in Yiddish, a capelage, a serious capel, right? And not the kind of little things that we put on our head today, but a serious capel which they made, of course, themselves, or the tailors made. 1848 to 1917. And they had 10 children. That, again, my father had no idea. He knew of 2 or 3, but he didn't know all the others. Avram Yitzchak, called Adolf, went as a chazan, a moel, a shoichet to New York, and was there from 1871. And he lived from 1871 to 1947, and he has family, grandchildren, great-grandchildren in America. Dov was killed by the Nazis in 1941 with his daughters and his wife. No survivors from there. Feige, Fanny, made the mistake of marrying a man who came from London and turned her head, and it turned out he was a bigamist. He'd been already married in London, and she had a very bad time with him. Some of the letters describe it. He beat her up regularly, and she died quite young. Her children also died. He came back to London, and if I'm not mistaken, he was caught for bigamy and went to prison. I have some family here who knows of him. Zygmunt Simcha, 1878 to 1956. He also went to America, and he has family living in California, others in other parts of America. Mendel disappeared, divorced his wife, and we have no record of him at all. We haven't yet found him, but he definitely went there to America. So you see already the people who went survived. My grandmother, Zondel Adel, born around 1885, was starved to death in the Kalisz ghetto. The family of Stefan Brzezinski, who was my father's friend, the Catholic, the family, in 1945, they wrote to my father, in Polish, of course, saying that they know that Jews always want to know the date of the death of their family. They can tell him that his mother died on such and such a date in 1942. She was starved to death in Kalisz ghetto before they took her to concentration camps. She didn't survive that, and the family said we tried to smuggle bread into the ghetto, but we didn't succeed very often. So that was the family who lost their son Stefan in the Second World War also. Meyer, Max, he sent his children away from Vienna, and 3 of them survived, and one is 105. She is in London, and her granddaughter has become very Haredi. It's astonishing because the family in Vienna was completely frei, as they call it, right? Konfessionslos in German, without any religion. And Elsa phoned me many years ago. You never guess what has happened. You know what has happened. I just paid 800 pounds for a child. You can imagine, from a Jewish woman from Vienna, from a very free-thinking Vienna, had to pay 800 pounds for a shaitel for her granddaughter. But granddaughter's a lovely family in Rubin. So he was in Italy, and he had fought in the First World War. And he showed the Nazis who came, when he came back from Italy, to fetch his remaining son and his wife. And of course, they were taken away and killed. He showed the Nazis his medals from the First World War. They trampled on them. Simply said there's no consequence. So he also perished. Reisel, Rose Brown, lived to a good old age. She has American also, family in America. Esther Erna, she was in a very difficult situation in Vienna. All this is reconstructed from what we know. And one son was in a concentration camp, was in a labor camp in Belgium, and he survived. And he has a daughter who's living today still, Susie, in Vienna. But he married a non-Jew, so Susie's not technically Jewish, and she married a man who's in the same situation as her. His father was Jewish, his mother wasn't, and they're very committedly interested in Israel and Judaism. So, and then there's Miriam, and she's a remarkable, I think, one day, my wife Renati is trying to persuade me to write a book about the whole thing, because there is a book here. One of the characters in the book is Mina. Miriam, Mirchik, as my father called her, Tante Mirchik. Tante Mirchik lived with the grandmother, the mother, my Baba, my Zondel, and her sister, and her mother, and Mina, and she was a teacher. And she has a lot to say about everything and everybody, all negative, which is interesting to read. She is obviously a very intelligent woman who didn't find, she has comments on all the husbands. Him, he's a Hochstapler. You know what a Hochstapler is? How can I translate Hochstapler? Hochstapler is someone who's no damn good but thinks he's good, very wonderful. That's a Hochstapler, right? And then she said about my grandfather, who was lost in the First World War, or disappeared in the First World War, or ran away in the First World War, we don't know. Him, he's a Gauner. A Gauner in German means a scoundrel. So we come from scoundrels and Hochstaplers. But she had a comment like that, and about the violent one, the one who'd beaten up poor Fanny. She also has very negative, and they're full of these comments about other people. These are pictures of Avram, Adolf, Sigmund, Reisel, Rosa. Erna went to Vienna, had a miserable life there, died in a concentration camp. Max also perished in a concentration camp. Here's my Baba in the middle, Zondel, and Mina. You can also see in the face of Mina there, that she's quite on the right, quite a determined woman, and we would call her a liberated woman. She was liberated because she had no time. She didn't want to get married, and she always has negative comments about men all the time. That's my Baba, my grandmother, who perished in the ghetto in Kalush. And this is Mina. Nice picture of her. Again, looking the way, seriously, we have lots of letters from her. Battles in Galicia, 1914 to 1916. These are the Russians in 1915. In probably what was Galicia, nearby anyway. Very badly organized lot, not really very well turned out. They lived by stealing from all the families wherever they could. And here the Austrian army, much more organized. So it was battles to and fro, all the time between the two groups, and they all treated the Jews badly. Here is an Austrian army pamphlet which says, you Jews, you shouldn't want to be under the Tsar. The Tsar is the person responsible for the Kishinev massacre. In the beginning of the 20th century, made a lot of people Zionists in Kishinev, and it was the Tsar who did it. In fact, it was the Tsar soldiers, Cossack soldiers, who in 1917 came to Kalush, and my father and his mother and his grandmother and his aunt all hid. And my grandfather, the one who saw Avner Yehuda Leib, said, I'm not leaving the house because they'll steal everything. So the Cossacks came and they saw that he had a gold watch. So they told him to give them the gold watch, which he refused to do. So they shot him. And my father's memory of that is that they came to, when my father and the other women in the family were hiding. My father was 6 years old. And they said, where is Leib? And they answered in Polish, Leib is no more. And my father's early memory as a 6-year-old is of the Cairo Geniza coming in to collect blood and all the bits and pieces, as it were, because I don't know what they used to kill him, but it was not a happy sight. So this is the... Now what's masses arriving is decipherment, transcription, translation, specialized knowledge, literacy, emotions. All these are what we learn from these texts. The role of women, the fact that Mina is so opinionated and so educated. She writes a very nice German. Socioeconomics, my great-grandmother also writes. So medicine, well, if we've got time, we don't really have much more time. We've got 5 more, 10 minutes, how long?
Carry on.
Carry on, okay, good. Good chairman, I like this chairman. Religious traditions, what was the situation? Many of them emigrated, as you saw before. What was the situation with military service? We have letters which say, can you find 100 gulden? 100 gulden was a lot of money. 100 gold pieces. Because that's the only way I can get out of serving in the army. One of them, I think it was Max. My grandfather, the Gauner, the scoundrel as he was known, he also wanted to try to get out of the army, but he didn't. Neither. He was either killed or he disappeared, or he was missing in action, or he absconded. We don't know. We have no idea. But the letters do reflect on that as well. Here is one of the letters. This is a letter from my great-grandfather, Reb Leib. Like his peyot there, really nice thick peyot. And here he's writing to Herrn Adolf Reif, Cantor. You know, in German you will also address somebody by his status, by his professional status. He's Cantor. Herr Stuhlweissenberg is Spittelblaser. He was first in Hungary, where he went. And his father's writing to him, am 1. des Monats habe ich ein kaiserliche Königliche von dir erhalten, dass du sollst verläuft werden. So I have, on the 13th of the month, now we struggled over it. In the Yiddish it's written, habe ich ein KK. Ein KK. What's a KK? And between us, Renati says, well, the stamps at that time would say Kaiserlich Königlich. Franz Josef, Kaiser und König. So it's something to do with Kaiser and König. And then I found that a reference at the time to a telegram. A telegram was called a Kaiserlich Königlich because it came in the name of the Kaiser and the König, right? And so he says, you're telling me that you're getting married. Ich habe geglaubt, dass du mir fürs einen Mazel Tov, damit ich soll euch gratulieren. I would have liked to congratulate you. You were going to tell me whether you get engaged. And hast du ein klein deinen Eltern vergessen? There's a lot of emotional blackmail. Clearly, you didn't tell us, so you've forgotten your parent. Now, you think he's angry. No. Die liebe Mutter is sehr zufrieden für die Schuhe. Dear mother's very happy with the shoes. Sie sind in ganz Galicia, sogar wir den Freund war gut. There's no such lovely shoes anywhere in Galicia. Die Mutter hat Arafir von dem Wein. She also, to translate Arafir, you can't say she got better. She had a great pleasure from the wine you sent. In Hadash gibt es nicht solche Wein. We don't have that. So he said, thanking them for all the goodies, he said. Mein Kind, du sollst nicht denken, dass du machst häusig aus deinen Eltern. Don't think you can make fun of your parents. Again, back to the emotional blackmail, right? Wir verstehen für euch alles. We know exactly what's going on. And your brother who looks after us, he says, Burghirsch is euch der Starkbräuges, auf dir Starkbräuges. He's really sickened by you. Sagt, dass will so schlecht sein als du. He's going to be just as bad as you. You look after the family. He's fed up with you, and he's going to be just as bad as you. So he writes, and then at the end, after all that, he says, Grüßen und Kissen. Die liebe Mutter schickt Grüßen und Kissen. But a little dig at the end. Sie wünscht dir a gute Heart. Mommy wishes you to have a better heart. Right? So again, and deine teure Vater, your dear father. So here you have the same thing. I translated it into English. And she wishes you a good heart. Wonderful. Yeah. So there you have a lot to learn from that. Nice Yiddish he writes. And then here's a letter that he says, I'm sorry I didn't answer you. And on line 8, where was he? He was in line 8, he was in the Dampfzüge. Fabrik. That's right. He was in the Dampfzüge Fabrik, which is probably a locomotive factory. Dampfzüge is steam engines. And there was one nearby, not very far away, where they made steam engines. What he did, I have no idea. Whether he was lending money or buying little things is not clear. Buying and selling. Here's another letter. Here's the letter. I've been in Rigoda at the locomotive factory. I had to work for a few gulden. Good news from you. Then he says, you're getting engaged. Congratulations. May God grant good fortune, hatzlocha, and your match should be successful. Yalla yufel yufel. The marriage should go very successful. May it be von Himmel gemacht. May it be made in heaven. And then he says something which the translator didn't understand. He said, why should he say this? God forbid you should ever be again a chosn. What kind of remark is that? But the remark is people died. People died young. Yeah. And the blessing was, please God, you should never be a chosn again. Because wives died, especially in childbirth, and men had to marry again. They weren't, couldn't boil an egg or whatever, so they had to, what was the point? You have to marry somebody, otherwise you don't laugh. I can point to friends in Beit Shemesh who lost their wives and told me, I have to find another wife, I can't make my own breakfast. So, even today. That's beautiful also to do with work, to do with wishes. And here is a letter from Chayish Prinsen, writing herself. She writes herself. And she writes as follows. She says, Deine liebe Brief habe ich erhalten und zahle dir mir, dass der liebe Futter nicht zu Hause ist. She says, I'm sorry, but that is not home. Trotz my liebe Kind, but in spite of that, my nominal Mutter, in my capacity as a mother, I feel I have to write to you, and I take over what he's doing, and I will look after what the cantor needs lots of documents, and she writes and tells him that she'll bring him the documents, but she needs money. You pay for the documents. I don't have any money. If you want to be taken care of, money is needed. I don't have any. If you send us a few gulden, everything will be taken care of. God help me, I'm not asking for any kreuzer, gold coins for myself. I'm poor. But I've been married legally for a long time. He's worried. In Galicia, you had a ksube, you had a marriage, nisui, but you didn't necessarily have it registered. It cost money. So many of our great-grandparents didn't have nicht gesetzlich geheiratet, not legally married. When they came to Vienna, many of them put that right. But she points out, I have been legally married for a long time. So they did have a certificate, obviously. You said you were going to send your father a winter coat. Please do so. Perhaps you have some old clothes and shoe wear that you could send. The old clothes and shoe wear was the translator made nothing of that. We had to work that out ourselves. If you do that, being a big mitzvah. God help you, God help me, I'm not requesting any money for myself, only for what's doing for you. So here you have a woman writing in her own hand, and she is the one who apparently reads German as well as Yiddish, and was quite educated. She ran the whole family for many years, in fact. Here's a letter to Zygmunt. Zygmunt is Simcha. He was already in America, Suffolk Street, New York, America, with a K. And another letter here. Here's a translation. Again, I'm wondering why I haven't had a single letter from you since the time when Mendel sent me $4. This I told you about right away in my postcard when I said I had properly received everything, but there's been no sign of life from you. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to write every time about needs and family events. I've had a very bad winter. I sit here without making a living. The people are at home, and Zondel, that's my great-grandmother, is still with me together with the child, which is probably not my father. It's probably his sister, and that's in itself an interesting problem. Max is unemployed. They're very cross. What is it that you have? We're very concerned. I won't venture to remind you, it's soon be Pesach. There are no prospects here. My only wish is I could have enough money to pay the rent. Please reply. Maya will be assessed for the military within 2 months. Erna is in Vienna. She wants to come home. She's having a bad time with her husband. Geisel also wants to go to America. She did. Here there's nothing for them to do. So you have, again, financial worries, the draft, and migration. Here, again, just go jumping on to the translation. He's talking about the grandson being bar mitzvah in New York. You didn't provide the correct address. The letter was scribbled over, gave the translator terrible problems because he couldn't work out what it was. It's a Yiddish expression. Ungemajgit. Ungemajgit is something which, I don't know if Shir remembers, but Daddy scribbled over. Ungemajgit. If I wrote something that wasn't very nice and neat, my father would say, listen, it's ungemajgit. It's not properly written, it's not nice. The translator had no idea what ungemajgit is. I guessed it might be ungemajgit like my father knew, and Renati knew it from German, from dialect German, from Bavarian dialect German. So what here, I'm going to end on this because I've spoken long enough. What's the message? I told Reisel, because I didn't get the letter, because it was ungemajgit, didn't know the correct address. She sent you congratulations, I wish you have great joy. May he be healthy. Dagobert was his name. May be healthy, honest, and fine person. He should put on tefillin every day. And then he gives a little drasha. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Kadosh li kol bechor. He was a firstborn. Adolf was a firstborn, Avram Yitzchak. And Dagobert was a firstborn. So he gives a little pshettel on this, that the firstborn is always devoted to God. From the Torah, just as my father devoted me, I have the privilege of devoting you, so God has helped you to commit your son also to it. May you have good joy from him, may you be honest and pious and good luck, may you educate him with great joy. It's made me very happy. Sending greetings. Please write to me about Simcha and Mendel and Reisel. Why doesn't Simcha write? Many regards, Grüßen and Kissen. Reply to me soon. So, I'm going to stop here because I've spoken long enough. And questions, comments?
First of all, Stefan, it really is remarkable when you get the chance to look back in the past. And I really been thinking very much about this because last night I took part in really a memorial meeting for Neville Natan, who spoke here a few times, died before he could complete his life's work, but with the help of Angela Lehrer and Susan, his wife, put together a remarkable 600-page volume, which covers, I only had a chance to look at a little bit of the foreword, but you can learn a lot from the way that he set things out, and I agree, Stefan, you're right, there is a book in there. The stories that we can get from the past do need to be told, and even if everybody's Brongus in every letter, they're Brongus for a reason, and the reasons that you know how to unpick the reason. And Stefan mentioned about my early contacts with his family when I was doing my first book about the history of the Jews in Scotland, and your uncle Abe was a great help because he represented the Edinburgh Stiebel and was very unsure about Rabbi Dicus coming to the city. I think his father had sent in a letter, the community is crank, so they appointed a doctor, a rabbi doctor, and that was really something they were a bit suspicious about. And it took them a number of years to realise that the doctor was actually quite a Jewish scholar himself. I don't know if Angela has any comments to look into somebody else's life and story, because you've been living with this kind of thing for a number of years now.
It took us 3 years. Neville actually wrote a lot of it himself. He wrote most of it himself, but putting it all together in book form was a real task. And you've got some wonderful examples here of the letters that you managed to retrieve, and your translations and so on, which really give life to the people in your family. Neville also did a lot of the history of Galicia. My side of the family comes from Galicia. His father's side came from Belarus. So he went into the history. He was comparing the two types of families. But this is a wonderful treasure trove, which you should actually. I think it would be a good idea if you want to make it into a
Stefan
book.
is no slouch when it comes to writing books, so it does have to be said. And it's very nice to be able to say to look back in the past and have something really tangible which describes exactly how life was and the struggles that of life in the past. I know other people here have stories of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and I don't know if anybody else has got any comments about how these letters have struck them in the context in which. Yes?
I thought this is a different tack. You mentioned your great-grandfather was in the Polish.
Can't hear you.
I'll repeat the question.
How difficult was it for Jews to get into that?
So my father was in the Polish army. My father was a little orphan who lost his father and his grandfather, so they sent him to train as what they Schlosser. A Schlosser was a locksmith, but a locksmith in those days was a metal worker. You work everything in metal. You make everything in metal. So you heat up metal and you build gates and locks and so. If anybody lost a key, my father would always say, "Bring me a key," something similar. So you put that one fit. Bring me a key that's similar, and he would work on it and file it that and make it fit. So that was his job for a few years, and then he decided he ran away 3 times to different places. One of the times he went to Palestine and spent his time fighting Arabs, and enjoyed that. And the British picked him up and put him in prison. And then he remembered it wasn't that bad in prison, it was okay, the British prison was fine, they made me sweep the floor, he said. And then they deported him to Poland. And I suspect that when he got deported to Poland, they called him up immediately to the Polish army. That was 1931, he was 20. And he remembers Chaya Spritzer. The last time he saw her, 1930, she died a few months later. The station in Kalisz, you can't get it anymore, but you used to be able to go from the house, the Reif houses, the 2 houses there, all the way along a path, and it took you to the other end of the station. And he was in his uniform waiting for the train, and as the train came in, his mother came running around, "Pinchas, Pinchasel, Pinchasel," and she had made him his favourite cake, and ran and gave it to him, and that was the last thing. So he was in the Polish army, which probably saved his life, because gave him something to fight for, gave him discipline, gave him order. Then when he finished the army in 33, 34, he thought, well, obviously not going back to Shtetl. So he joined the Polish Merchant Navy. Back again to Israel. He was on the boats coming from Constanza in Romania to Haifa in 5-day journey, I think it was, 5-day voyage, once every 2 weeks. And then that's how he was saved, because in 1939, he was in one of those boats when the army, the war broke out. And so it's a long, so that gave him, but my grandfather tried to avoid the army but couldn't, and that's what he wanted money for, but the family didn't have any money, so he joined up, and in 1 year after he joined up, disappeared, and we don't know whether he was killed, whether he was missing in action, or whether he absconded somewhere. Mirchik, Tante Mirchik, suspects all terrible things, but she does that about everybody anyway. So, but maybe she's right, maybe he did. I haven't found I don't even know his name. My father took his mother's name. Right, we think it was Kafka. Kafka is a Czech. My father said that his mother said that your daddy was from Czechoslovakia. So it's possible from related family, I don't know. But we know nothing about him at all. And only the things that Mirchik says, which are not very complimentary.
Have you been to Stanislav?
Did we go to Stanislav? We went to, yes, Ivano-Frankivsk. We were in Ivano-Frankivsk. Yeah, they were that's right. Yeah, we were there. No, not Shabbat. We're not in Shabbat. We went there to look at the documents. We went to Ivano-Frankivsk.
How big is the community now?
Well, now there's a Chabadnik. Well, there was a few years ago. I don't know about now in the war.
Yeah.
But there was a Chabadnik who welcomed us and took us into there were a few archives where we looked at 19th century cities in Poland, in Galicia, and we found lots of Reifs. Not an uncommon thing. Lots and lots of Reifs. Whether they're family or not family, I don't know.
And my mother's family Gutentag all came from there.
Yeah.
In fact, my mother was born there.
In Stanislav.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Her mother, I don't know why, she ran away from Gateshead and wanted to have this child in Stanislav. I don't know, which went back to her parents.
Wow.
Very strange story.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yes, at the back.
Firstly, thank you very much. It's very interesting. I have two questions. The first is a technical one. When you gave the list of your great-grandfather's 10 children, how did you come to so much kind of information about when they were born and where they went and so on?
All the letters, if you put them together, you get a fairly good idea. When you saw question marks, there are some that we don't, like my grandmother, we don't quite know where she was born, but you can fit her into the others. The problem is they came to America and they declared their birth dates to the American authorities, and that's them recording. But in one case, we think that Reisel gave Zondel's date of birth because that made her older, and she wasn't old enough to be accepted there. So that already makes it a bit suspicious, right? So you have to be a bit careful. But that's how we managed to put together most of it. How we know about when he was killed, we have the letter, we know when they were married because of, he mentions about somewhere, I can't remember now, but we know exactly that she was 16 years old. And we can work out all these things pretty well, especially from the family who went to the States because they had documentation. And the great-grandmother who was writing saying, you want documentation, I have to find you documentation. She obviously did that. She found the documentation, he sent her money, and she found the documentation so that, okay. He was then in Hungary and he wanted to go to America. So he needed all the paperwork.
So the second thing I wanted to ask, I actually have an interview that I did with my grandmother who grew up in Galicia, in Brody. So it's from the first decade of the 19th century. Of the 20th century,
20th century.
And there it's very interesting. She talks about the good relations they had with their non-Jewish neighbours, and I was curious if that was a topic that came up in the letter.
It depends on the neighbours. I mean, clearly the Brzezinskis were friendly. My father was happy to have a friend, a non-Jewish, a Catholic boy, two Jewish boys and one Catholic boy, all did the naughty things together. So there were families that were quite friendly. Families who made light fires for them on Shabbos, that kind of thing. Shabbos going. In Cambridge, one Shabbos afternoon, all the lights went off to switch, you know. There was a fuse. So one of the Hebra went out into the street, and he stopped a woman and he said, this is a synagogue, and we have a problem. You want me to be a Shabbos guy, she said. So he said, yes, but how? I was brought up at the East End of London. I used to make my pennies every week from being a Shabbos guy. So it was very, I mean, Eliyahu, I know, he obviously sent afternoon to put the lights on for us. Yeah. So there were good relations, friendly relations, and there were the opposite, of course. Sure.
Ukrainians.
Pardon?
Dad used to talk about the Ukrainians.
And yes, the Ukrainians, and we met that. The Ukrainian peasants were fairly anti-Semitic. It was a primitive anti-Semitism. Sharon, Renati and I were there, and the guide was talking about, do you remember the Jews? Oh yes, I remember the Jews. he said, terrible. They used to take everything and make life impossible for us. Why? Well, they used to collect all the eggs from the farms and give us money for all our eggs, and then take them to market and make a profit from them. So the woman said, well, why didn't you do that? But we didn't know how to go to the market, what to open the market stall, and how to sell the eggs. So he had negative things to say about the Jews, but the Jews brought him his living, actually. He was an old man at the time. So you see the kind of very primitive anti-Semitism which has gone on for a long time.
Yes, it's been quite interesting that there's been a project in Canada by Ukrainian Canadians to have a rapprochement with the Jews, and they've really produced a lot of material. So some enmities don't go on forever. Right. Anybody else got anything they would like to add? Let me just finish this, Stefan, by saying how much we've appreciated this, your normal great presentational skills, your bit of humour, and really a good story to tell, and that's the basis of it, so I think we should show our appreciation. So we have a programme really for the rest of the session till the summer. Unfortunately, I can't give you a precise date with each one. Les Wagner is speaking next time. Les was engaged to write the official biography of the late Rabbi Sachs. He had only completed about a quarter to a third of it when Les really took very seriously ill and had to pass on the writing to somebody else who's now been appointed. But Les has a lot of material about Rabbi Sachs's early years and his early years in the rabbinate, and we'll talk about Rabbi Sachs, the making of a rabbi. He hopes to be able to give me a date sometime later this week, and we will let you know as soon as we hear. The following month, Kai Raphael will be talking about From Rags to Riches, the story of the Barnato family. And in June, Fleur Hassan, I can never remember which way around, Fleur Hassan will be talking about the history of the Jews in Gibraltar, which is a little bit more exotic of the English-speaking Jewries, and so that may well be the final meeting before the summer. So we will be in touch, and we will look forward to seeing you and many more at the meetings which follow. Thank you.